Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Whispers of the Deep. My name is Draken. This is the going over of Chapter 2, Aeril 1, or rather, Chapter 1, but Chapter 2 following the prologue. So, to begin, let's begin with a brief summary of what happens in the chapter. So, this chapter follows Aeril, where he is coming home to Erdonia, the part of the Empire in Noria which he lives. For the past 5 years, Aeril has been training in a religious scribal order named the August Order of Rooks, however, has yet to fully complete his initiation. Coming home, he disguises himself to make himself unknown to his brother and someone in their household. And then, after making himself revealed and reuniting with the people he used to live with, he then goes down to to the Undercroft of Castle Ravencroft to pay respects to his dead mother. So let's be, as always, we'll begin with the epigraph. So, as usual, the epigraph comes from a in-universe text. This is Gaius Aeschyle's Dorian history. And from there on out, we immediately are basically hammered with this idea of this is an analog for the Roman Empire. Northern history is a play on the Roman history of Cassius Dio, which is a third century text, which, however, writes of things happening in the previous century. So, through this idea, if this holds, Gaius Aeschylus is writing the Northern history a good deal into the timeline of the empire. And in fact, this section of the Northern history happening near the beginning says that Noria is in fact the creation of there used to be two polities, a kingdom of Calais and a republic of Mycenae. The Calaeans then conquered the Mycenaeans, enslaved them, and then a couple generations later, this guy named Melanthius the Great, the person who's mentioned in the previous chapter's epigraph, becomes the first emperor of the empire in Noria. So, following on this trend, the first line, he stopped for arms and men in a grove of stone oaks. So this scene is basically Iroh gets stopped by some highwaymen, flashes his amulet, and they decide to not mess with him. However, the opening, arms and men, is a callback to the opening line of the Aeneid, Arma Virum Goicano, I sing of arms and men. So, however, this isn't just what's happening. They are in a ruin, and based off of various things said for rain and dried rivers, drying cisterns, there wasn't enough rain in the previous seasons, and now a famine is coming. And here we have Hyrule being met by three. They might be soldiers, they might be highwaymen, who is to say? However, the four horses are russet, white, black, and pale brown, which mirror the four horsemen of the apocalypse, which is 8-year-old Nosebleed is riding a pale brown mare, which places him as death. So essentially, Iroh coming back to Erdonia is death coming to Erdonia, which death in the sense of like the tarot card doesn't represent a dramatic change. And in fact, Iroh coming back is one of the inciting incidents for this story. So throughout Iroh's conversation with these people, like his starting in High Norian, thinking of keeping them off balance, Iroh truly has a level of contempt for these people who he truly thinks are beneath him. Generally, from the way we hear Iroh speak of their type was plain to see and so forth, Iroh is someone who basically already thinks he has the world figured out and is not above putting generalizations on people and is not above using archaisms because he feels like it. This is where we get Iroh repeatedly uses the word "afore" in his narration of this chapter. And then this, when he says they'd asked who he was, who are you, where you come from, which is a very archaic, very old-fashioned greeting. So they ask who he is, then they ask for his money, and the reason they're asking for his money is basically a toll to keep the roads safe. Now, who to keep the roads safe from? Nowadays, maybe these people themselves, if they are bandits and not actually soldiers, with wearing what appear to be coats of arms of red and white, but we don't actually know. So here we get introduced this idea that there was the nascent Emperor Noria, which seems to be Tychon Otho, and that some time ago, about 10 and 3 years ago, there was a civil war between Kaiser the False, Melta the Dowager, Sarpedon Stonetooth, and Tychon Otho. And based off this, we learned that Tychon Otho defeated these three other claimants to the throne and has been ruling ever since. And about at the same time that this civil war happened, a massive amount of silver was discovered on the Adonite lands of Procne Adon, who's the empress. And with the name of Procne Adon, her lands being the silver it's found on, which is the land of Erdonia, it seems that Procne um uh, the person in head of this part of the empire, Erdonia, and she with her wealth has become empress. The causal relationship between all these things is a bit murky, but that seems to be the general flow that Procne Adon was wealthy and and now because of that she's empress, and the emperor was able to use her wealth to beat these three other contenders to the throne in some civil war in the past. Here we have the this acknowledgement that while the rulers might not appreciate such basically highwaymen in Erdonia, they are unawares of things going on in the realm, which is troubling, shall we say. So then we have the masked grips emblazoned on their breasts. They seem more like highwaymen squeeze until someone finally makes us a squeeze, scamper, repeat. Which is it's a fun line, but we have this image of the masked grips. In the epigraph, we learn that the grip seems to be the symbol of the royal house, or rather the royal house of Melanthios. However, the symbol has been augmented by a mask, which, based off this context, seems to be the symbol of Tychon Otho's house, the Authorids. So this might imply that there has been some kind of dynastic change between the beginning of the empire and what stage the empire is in now. So Aeril shows him the amulet. So it's a stylized eye, a bead of shimmering bronze in place of its pupil. So we have bronze on iron, goldish color on blackish color, which is interesting in a word. And then we have the dancing of runes, runic constellations, and then we don't learn what Aeril has specialized in his time at the Eastern Rookery, but we'll learn eventually. Now, as for the rooks, rooks are like black birds essentially, and it seems that they're called your sapiens. It seems this august order of rooks, they are associated with knowledge, they are associated with the ravens, evoking the ravens of Odin, which bring knowledge around the world and tell Odin what they've seen. And then Aeril is a hatchling, as in someone who's probably hasn't yet completed his vows and 5 years of training. And that he says, even if their mysteries are not yet fully mine, what the mysteries of the rooks are is something interesting because later in the chapter, Lucian mentions that he asks if Aeril's initiation had been complete, and the initiation involved being trapped in a room for a day and a night without food or water, which one evokes corpse hands from the previous chapter, but two makes us think that this religious order of the Rooks is a bit more culty than, like, say, your normal public-facing religion. So down here we have a bit of classicism where Iroh thinks about how these people are used to shaking down farmhands and cobblers, and who are and then they are being shaken down by cobblers, and they are shaking down cobblers and farmhands, and these men think they're the big men of the world shaking down farmhands, when no, they are also small men. And this great game is the game of empires. That's like think of Risk or chess or something like that. That we have the everyone here are pawns, and is pawns fighting other pawns, but the pawns don't think that. And Iroh thinks himself essentially on behalf of the rooks in their august order, so he's not a pawn, he's a bishop or a rook in this metaphor of chess. And then here, throughout the entire passageway, we have the person on the red horse, the person on the red horse, the person on the white horse, the person on the black horse, and they get reduced to just the color of their horses, really showing the amount of contempt Iroh has for these people. So here we have the description of Erdonia, its rolling plains going up to these mountains, and we have Castle Ravencroft, which is this ancient, small, absolutely dilapidated castle, and that it resembles a sacked city, and it is, however, it is our ancient, and far above there's the ruins of a great stone road leading nowhere and going nowhere, the maker long since forgotten. So this combined with these pillars of stone which surround Aeril and the highwaymen at the beginning of the chapter really key us into this idea this world is ancient. And not only is this world ancient, the people in this world today have forgotten who built these things in the past. So Iroh goes through Ravencroft Village and he stops on the bridge and sees the haunted ruins below. How far down the gorge is, we don't really know, and what these ruins are, it seems there's something spooky going on with them. Iroh talks to Eli, and he takes care. He says he gives the horse and a silver drachm. So drachms are from drachma, which is the one of the main silver currencies in ancient Greek society. Similarly, dinars is from the Latin denarius, which is another silver-based currency popular in the Roman Empire. With in fact the weight values of the silver drachm and the silver drachma and the silver denarius being keyed during much of the early part of the Roman Empire, the Roman Principate. Here also, where if we learn that, because Iroh knows of Eli's injury and a bunch of other things, we get the idea that Iroh really is familiar with this place and keys us in that he's probably from the castle. So we get the description that it's 6 to house a horse for a day, and Iroh gave him 4 with 1 drachm, and he says it's 2 more dinars. So that tells us that in simple currency conversions, it is 4 dinars to a drachm, which is fun. Congratulations, we know how the currency works. Um, Iroh reveals himself, and then we get this idea of Iroh revealing himself to a servant of the house he is returning to. This is calling back another myth, which is the Odyssey and Odysseus coming home in disguise first and being recognized by his dog, and then revealing himself to a swineherd. That Iroh is playing the role of Odysseus in the scene, going back to the house of his family. And then inside we have a recreation of another story, which keys us into what sorts of people these are. So we have basically there are 2 lavender farmers. Now, as lavender is mentioned as being useful for Arcanine hunting, what these are exactly remains to be seen. But point is, lavender is a valuable crop, yet there are 2 farmers. One of them, a man of 30, is well dressed, and one of them, twice his age, is dressed very poorly. And they're arguing about where the old man's farm is burned down, but the young man says um, that his farm didn't burn down because he dug a ditch between their farms because he expected something like this would happen, and blames the old man for barbecuing very, very poorly. And then yeah, it's a sort of like this is age thing, and then eventually we have this idea of justice is put forward, and the Lord Lucian Marula. Iroh knows a lot about Lucian Marula's description because he's seen him before, and then he gets this idea of Martinus, the young man, um gives Tatian, the old man, half his crop, and then will be given half of that back from his he'll give half of his crop he'll give half of his crop to Tatian, get half of that back from Lucian's personal gardens, and will also be able to buy. So essentially, if and being by a discount rate is most likely lower than the market price. So Martinez is not actually losing any of his crops. He has the same amount that he's began with, but he's basically been let off with a warning. And then this idea of someone has lost something and the other person hasn't lost something, and the idea that they're going to split it in order to have a sense of justice. And one of the people says sure, and one of the people says never. This is a recreation of the story of Solomon and the 2 women with the baby that is going to be sawed in half. Except here, instead of a baby, we're having a crop of lavender. And Lucian puts this forward and has Martinez pulled away into the cells. What will in future chapters we'll learn what happens to him. So here we get Rubifair, which is one of the household guards, and then now we have Iroh approach. So Aeril's tracking is tracking dirt into the Great Hall, which is uncomely of him, unseemly of him. But he's called Nicander of the Many Paths, which from Fair Calais, and its southern tell of spires of gold, southern tell of spires of gold, alabaster, and blood. So in archaeology, a tell is basically where people live at a site for hundreds or thousands of years, and the site actually forms an artificial mountain of just all the debris from the human inhabitation. So Fair Calais seems to be some important city, and there are spires. What exactly the spires are, we'll figure out in the past, but if they're what they seem to be like, they seem to be large stone towers, and one of them is reserved for the gods, one of them is reserved for alabaster, and one of them is blood. So whatever those mean. And Lucian has picked up on this myth of near Nicander of the Many Paths, that in the actual story, Nicander is from Near Circaia. So Aeril is playing the role of Nicander, is not actually Nicander. And then he says this Nicander comes from Fair Calais, and then he counters with saying, "Where's the actual lord of the castle, who is Casimir Marula?" And since Aeril and Lucian are brothers, Casimir's their father, who is at Green Navria, at Tychon Otho's pleasure, with sword path being a penning or a sort of fun hidden metaphor or simile for on campaign. And then Iroh asks for honey, wine, and water, which are needed to make sacrifice or respect to the dead. And then Fortuna comes forward. Fortuna recognizes Iroh more readily. However, whether or not Lucian has at this point recognized Iroh is also a matter of interpretation. So he says he fell asleep under an ebon gloam tree and spent 8 years finding his way back home. What ebon globe trees are a special type of tree in this world that are dark with golden fruit, which we'll get the description of in a couple future chapters. And he says, I thought it took 8 years. Perhaps I'm 3 years early. However, this idea of falling asleep a gold and black tree and then finding your way somewhere far away, if the gold and black trees are meant to be evocative of whatever portals we saw in the prologue, then this would suggest these portals make you lose time or make you end up somewhere else. So it's good to see you. They reunite, but Fortuna Lucian's legate is far, far less cordial with Iroh. Just far less cordial. And they say, and Iroh says, nearly as much as being in this place called ours. Fortuna snorted and stepped back behind Lucian. Iroh seems to have said something to Fortuna, and Fortuna recognizes it but doesn't say. That's why Iroh says they play the part well as ever. So Iroh compliments Lucian on his jurisprudence, and Lucian asks questions about that. But now we go down to one of the more interesting parts of the chapter, which is revealed that all of Castle Ravencroft, or at least a large portion of it, is built on top of a giant hole in the ground called the Chasm of the Crypt, which is essentially giant tunnel going down into earth with a spiral staircase around the edge. And into various points on the edge have been built rooms used for various things, such as a library, storehouses, and the Undercroft where the ancestor worship happens. And it says that 1,000 years ago, when the castle was being built, they discovered the chasm and they basically just put a floor on it, and no one knows what's down at the bottom. But whatever it is, it's pretty spooky because when they sent two people down at the first time, only one of them came back and he was insane. Now, this has this idea that the Maruli, they're built on a foundation of nothing, or rather, if the Maruli in this feudalistic society are like a stand-in for the powers that be, the powers of be are built on literally nothing, that there literally is a giant hole in the ground where the foundations should be, and we don't know what's at the bottom. However, we get this imagery of the chasm of the crypt being sort of like a beast in the throat of a giant beast, which mirrors the tunnel that Hamak goes to in the prologue, and also this Prince of Beasts figure he finds on the throne in this weird cave dream dimension that he goes into when he goes through the portal. So Iroh has memories of so we have this important line of in winter, water collect on the solids and trickle down steps, making them a danger to traverse. And summer, though silent, the tower itself seemed to breathe. So we really get this idea that the chasm of the crypt is alive in some kind of way, which is rather spooky. Aeril thinks about the time he threw a yellowish lamp down into the black abyss and ran up thinking he was being chased by monsters. The amethyst-eyed hound, we don't know what that means, but duly note that Hamek went through the portal. The god that was holding the censer had a purple torque, and amethysts are a purple gemstone. And then the shadow which slew Sharon's clear sight, we figures from folklore. We don't know what those are yet. So taking a deep breath, Aeril goes through into the Undercroft, and here we have this wall full of imagines, which are the faces of the dead in Roman ancestral worship. That's made of plaster, made of wood, made of stone, made of many different meanings. But essentially, it's a funeral mask, and the funeral masks have been laid up against the wall like the stars. And the idea is like when people die, they become these masks and then become the stars. And Iroh takes the wine and takes the water and takes the honey and mixes it together into this dark viscous liquid and then pours it down like a gullet to feed the masks essentially. That their flesh is now his flesh, and he's like returning that energy back to them as a form of worship. However, he can't seem to find where his mother is, which is sad. The term patera actually is the libation bowl used for ancestral worship. So this whole scene is incredibly spooky, and there really feels like this sort of sacrificial method to it. And however, this method of being underground close to the spirits of the earth and then pouring liquid onto the earth is the ancestral custom in Ardonia. And similarly to how we have the shaft in the chasm of the crypt, makes us think of the giant chasm of the crypt outside and how it's a giant shaft, which you could also pour things down into as a form of sacrifice. How much these are connected, who is to say? But it's something that's there regardless. And then here, for the second time at the end of the chapter, we get the mention of a special amulet Aeril has around his neck, something that he lets absolutely no one see, and he treasures a lot. And then he begins to pray, and that's where the chapter ends. Next time, we're going to go through Fortuna 1, most like, and that's a very interesting chapter, which has a very different vibe, where this chapter is about like religion and justice and mistaken identities and personal agency and what people think of the world and their place in it. Fortuna 1 is much more interpersonal. See you next time. Bye-bye.